Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will discuss Taiwan's president's visit to the small African country of eSwatini. You heard a lot about it, and we are going to close this chapter with a real exploration of what it means and what actually happened. Then we will discuss Sanae Takaichi's visit to Australia and the reactions to it. But first, let's go to our interview. Taiwan's president Lai Ching-te has visited the Kingdom of eSwatini, a small country in southern Africa that maintains diplomatic relationship with Taiwan rather than the People's Republic of China. That was quite an adventure. It was quite difficult to get there. It created a lot of stir and a lot of debates, and it has a lot of aspects to explore. So let's discuss it with two people who commented about it, Sasha Chhabra and Marcin Jerzewski. Sasha and Marcin, hello.
Thanks for having me
Hello,
on
thanks
again.
for
I would kindly ask you, gentlemen, to introduce yourself. Maybe Marcin first.
hello everyone. My name is Marcin Jerzewski, and I'm the head of Taiwan office for the European Values Center for Security Policy.
I'm Sasha
And
Chhabra, and I'm a Taipei-based security analyst and commentator on foreign policy issues. And I write about all of these issues, including on the Eswatini issue, on my Substack, Formosa Review.
Thanks very much. So, first and foremost, let's try to just talk about the facts. If one of you two want to just tell us what happened, how did Lai Ching-te get to Eswatini and why?
Absolutely. As you mentioned in the introduction, Eswatini is one of the very few remaining formal diplomatic allies of ROC Taiwan, and the only one remaining on the African continent. So, to this end, the current administration continues the policy of its predecessors, paying a lot of attention to maintaining these formal diplomatic ties. We can go into the details for why Taipei considers these uh, relations with seemingly small and globally insignificant countries to be important. But this time, the occasion was to celebrate birthday of King Mswati III, the last absolute monarch on the continent, to whom Lai wanted to pay his respects as the formal diplomatic ally.
And this is a relationship that in itself is quite contentious. And Sasha, you have been quite critical of it, actually. If you can give us the facts that makes this relationship a bit, let's say, unsavory, to say the least.
Well, as Marcin mentioned, King Mswati III is the last absolute monarch on the African continent. He is also known as, Africa's Epstein. This is a guy who's a notorious child predator. Every year, he forces adolescent girls in the kingdom to parade naked before him, and he kidnaps a so-called wife or two from this parade. They're locked in his palaces. Some attempt to escape his abuses, and all of this is in a country that a majority live in abject poverty, about a third to a fourth of the adult population, depending on measurements, are HIV positive. And every year on these birthday parties, he buys himself a new fleet of Mercedes. He gets a new palace for each, so-called wife. And this is all in a very small collection of mountainous villages sandwiched between South Africa and Mozambique. That's essentially, a relic of the colonization process of Southern Africa, which left this hermit kingdom under a semi-sovereign situation. So that alone is I think contentious enough that anyone is trying to engage with such a disgusting regime as Martin's alluded to, and as we can get into, there are some reasons why Taipei thinks it's important to continue this. But I would say one of the important things to note is the repulsiveness of the regime there aside, where all opposition parties are banned, human rights activists are disappeared regularly, tortured, and security forces open fire regularly on students, on protesters. I believe this is a relationship that brings no value to Taiwan and no support for Taiwan's sovereignty and security in the long term.
So that puts Taiwan in quite a difficult situation. On one hand, trying to make the best of whatever little formal diplomatic relationship it has, and on the other hand, finding itself compromised with such a regime. Marcin, you have written a piece on Taipei Times in which you explained the reasons why and how Taiwan can find some sort of benefit in it. Can you please explain to us what you mean?
Absolutely. Taiwan's statehood is contested, and it has been contested with an increased momentum since the transfer of the UN seat for China from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China under the UN General Assembly Resolution 2758. And in order to understand why maintaining formal diplomatic partnerships might matter to Taipei, we have to understand that there are different theories of statehood in international law. Under a declaratory understanding of statehood, Taiwan already meets the objective criteria for statehood, and recognition merely acknowledges that fact. So Taiwan meets the definition of for statehood under the declaratory understanding of this concept because it meets the criteria of the Montevideo Convention, a clearly defined territory with a clearly defined population, and the monopoly on the control of this territory and exercise of laws within this territory. However, there is also a different view on statehood, and it is the constitutive understanding of statehood. Under the constitutive view, recognition by other states is what carries greater weight because it helps constitute sovereign status in practice. In the real world, both logics matter, but given that the People's Republic of China is actively deploying legal warfare as a part of its three warfares doctrine vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's the doctrine of political warfare of the People's Liberation Army. Taiwan is seeking to assert its place in global politics using both understandings of statehood. So, to this end, we can understand Taipei's allies not only as these post-Cold War decorative relics, but rather a part of Taipei's argument rejecting the People's Republic of China's legal warfare against it and rejecting its argument that Taipei is unable to enter international relations on its own terms. So, in the spirit of a phrase that President Lai has been repeating since his very inauguration, maintaining these formal diplomatic partnerships might be one of the ways in which Taipei seeks to demonstrate that both sides of the strait are not subordinate to each other, that Taipei is not a subordinate of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you very much for this explanation, both of you. Now, I'm going to challenge both of you actually one after the other, not to be contradictory, but just to put myself into the shoes of an audience who tries to understand all this situation. I'll start with you, Marcin. Very simply, Sasha just mentioned a horrible situation in eSwatini. So he seems to openly question whether it is worth it to associate with that kind of regime. What would you have to answer to this? Does it really worth it? Does it worth engaging with such a monarch for the legal argument it brings to Taiwan? And couldn't Taiwan get the same kind of legal leverage without engaging with the king of Eswatini?
The engagement with authoritarian regimes under the aegis of formal diplomatic relations is definitely a reputational problem for Taipei. So even though I try to show my understanding and give the benefit of the doubt as to why the Foreign Ministry of Taiwan still prioritizes engagements with the diplomatic allies to such an extent, I am not saying that this cooperation is flawless, and I believe that engaging in a conversation about a real cost-benefit analysis of maintaining these partnerships, or in other words, engaging in a conversation whether Taipei should really assign as much value to the constitutive understanding of statehood, is a valid task, and it remains an open question. Indeed, it may seem like Taipei is trying to have its cake and eat it too. On the one hand, emphasizing the importance of normative alignment and the success story of Taiwan's democratization that has positioned it as a like-minded partner of the European Union, for example. I'm mentioning the European Union specifically because that's one of the informal partnerships that Taipei maintains, where these normative alignments are emphasized most consistently and most conspicuously. And then on the other hand, it lends support to an absolute monarch in a country that is ruled in a way that's a polar opposite of what Taipei aspires to instill as its own model of governance. Sasha has rightly alluded to gender-based violence in Eswatini, as well as an abysmal public health situation, as demonstrated by the high incidence of HIV infections. The list of problems continues. The existence of political parties is illegal in Eswatini. There are significant crackdowns on freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The LGBTQI plus community is also under assault under Mswati III's dictatorial rule. So these contradictions are absolutely there, and that's also that the question of poor quality of governance in Taiwan's diplomatic allies is an underexplored issue in Taiwan's cooperation with these other partners whom it calls like-minded. So there is definitely a lot of space for Taiwan to mobilize resources that it is already deploying in diplomatic allies and move them away from parsimoniously speaking checkbook diplomacy and budget support for these authoritarian governments, and instead use these resources for democracy promotion, work with the civil society. Unfortunately, this is not currently being done.
Thank you, Marcin. Now back at you, Sasha, and thank you very much for giving us very valuable information on the true situation in Eswatini, which sadly too much people, including in Taiwan, are unwilling to see or at least not informed about. Now, the way we could challenge it, though, is saying, well, Taiwan is not the only country in the world that has relationship with Eswatini or with unsavory and violent regime, and we would love, of course, if every diplomacy was based on values, but sadly the reality is that countries interact with each other even when they shouldn't, and this is something that we are hardly in a position to change. So what would Taiwan lose if it were the one country who decided to follow values and not engage with Eswatini when all other countries are applying this kind of realpolitik? Can you tell us if there is any sort of reason, good reason why Taiwan should carry on?
I think you raised a very good point, Julien. And I would say that Taiwan does not practice realpolitik, and it should. And let me outline the case. Just there, you pointed out the difference between diplomatic relations and allies. And unfortunately, the term has become conflated in the Taiwanese context. So yeah, almost every country in the world has diplomatic relations with Eswatini. But when is the last time you saw a country do a state visit to Eswatini? And you'll find there are not many other than Taiwanese state visits, because most world leaders realize it's not a good club to be palling around with over there. Even Jeffrey Epstein thought it would be a stain on his reputation to be seen there. So you can have diplomatic relations with countries, but should you call them an ally? And it's very interesting in the Taiwanese context in the last couple decades, this term diplomatic ally has emerged. And these are countries that recognize the Republic of China. They don't actually recognize Taiwan, right? They recognize the Republic of China as this relic of when, the PRC and the ROC competed over, who would get more votes in the UN and be the legitimate China. And we're well past that, as Marcin has pointed out. PRC has won that. They have the seat in the UN. And, no one in Taiwan post-democratization is calling to, exercise control over, so-called mainland China or Mongolia, although there's some, relics as well of these islands in the South China Sea. But that's all said and done. That's gone. And the question now is, if Taiwan is not competing to get recognition in the UN or by a majority of states, and if it's not claiming to be China, then what does it need? Who are the states it needs to have relations with? What is it gaining from Eswatini? Yeah, sure, it's gaining that one vote in the UN, and it has about, I don't know, 11 votes in the UN at this point, because the Vatican doesn't vote, and actually, I don't even think they would vote for Taiwan if they had the chance. They haven't had formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan since 1979, which I think is a very misunderstood topic here. But getting more to the point, Taiwan needs allies. It needs to act in a very realpolitik manner, which means that the countries it needs to have the strongest relations with are the ones that can help maintain its security, its economy, and its standing in the world. Martin has highlighted the very important values-based partnership that is leading to a lot of growth with EU relations, and that's very, very important. And unfortunately, something that counteracts that is this despicable subsidies to, the murderous dictator of Eswatini. The same week as there's this state visit going on, there was the, EU dialogue with Taiwan about values, and there are all these statements about how there are all these common values of democracy and freedom and respect for human rights. But that's happening at the same time as Taiwan is sending bags of cash to underwrite a regime that's robbing its own people and leaving them in despicable conditions. And as Martin has also alluded to, MOFA is spending a great deal of time. The foreign ministry spends a good, huge percentage of resources and time on these, 11 to 12 states and quasi-states that have the diplomatic relationship. And that's coming at the expense of strengthening relationships with countries that matter. I mean, just look at, there's going to be a summit in Beijing next week, and the foreign ministry has publicly stated they're really worried that Trump is gonna, screw them over or throw them away in Beijing. And that reflects a real failure in the last several years of Taiwanese foreign ministry to adapt to a changing United States, to adapt to a second Trump administration that's much, much more populist, much divergent from traditional foreign policy consensus, and is really a changing, different world. And we can look to where Taiwan's opportunities for growth of defending its security. It's going to need to improve relationships with the Philippines, with Australia. It's going to need to work with partners such as Indonesia that may not agree with a lot of what Taiwan asserts in terms of its sovereignty and its democratic nature. But that's a very, very important relationship that is going to be fundamental to Taiwan's economic and security futures. So these are the relationships Taiwan needs to focus on. Those countries in its own neighborhood, those countries that will actually defend it, the United States, Japan, Philippines, potentially Australia, and like-minded countries that are also important economic partners, such as in Europe, in Canada, and elsewhere.
Thank you. So here we are actually reaching an interesting conclusion is that the problem is not even having formal diplomatic relationship with Eswatini, because having diplomatic relationship is just some sort of bureaucratic things that countries do. And as Marcin said, well, having some diplomatic relationships for Taiwan kind of serves a purpose in its legal status, but that doesn't necessarily mean it should be labeled diplomatic allies, which is kind of a strange, overblown terms, like just because someone has an embassy, suddenly they are a diplomatic ally, and that certainly doesn't necessarily mean going to shake hands with the dictator of Eswatini and spending money on him. So now the question I want to ask, because we are just three guys discussing it, and we know about that. Surely the people at MOFA, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan, are smarter than us and more informed than us. So why don't they take that into account? Why don't they try to change this? Why are they not trying to do it differently then?
I think three really important questions to guide our discussion. If Eswatini changes recognition tomorrow, which we all know will happen if the aid is cut off, it's not like there's this deep, familial relationship between the two countries. If the aid is cut off, they will switch to the PRC. Will that make the PRC less or more likely to invade? Will that make the US more or less likely to defend Taiwan? We also know the US has no formal diplomatic relations or official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Does that have any impact on the likelihood of the United States to defend Taiwan, to sell arms to Taiwan, to have deep, deep economic intercourse with Taiwan? And third of all, do we think that if a country like Honduras is being discussed switches back so-called to recognizing the ROC this year, will that have any impact on Beijing's determination to take Taiwan? So those are the framing questions that I want us to have in mind, and I would like Taiwan's MOFA to have in mind in this sort of discussion.
I believe that the questions posed by Sasha are extremely important, and these very questions should be guiding a more holistic inter-ministerial discussions about the importance of maintaining these partnerships. I would venture to say that these are issues of concern not only for the foreign ministry, but given that they touch upon questions such as the nation's defense, everybody should also keep them in mind. But I would like to return to your original question, Julian, as well. Why does Taipei assign so much importance, so much value to maintaining these partnerships? And I believe that a lot of it has to do with the ongoing debates within Taiwan about its residents' relationship with the institutions of the Republic of China. We have seen, particularly during Tsai Ing-wen's presidency, that she has really sought to navigate the difficult relationship between her identity as a leader of Taiwan and the president of the Republic of China, Even presidents from the Democratic Progressive Party, like Tsai Ing-wen or William Lai, have upheld many of the state symbols of the Republic of China. For example, large-scale celebrations of the Double Ten Festival, the anniversary of the Xinhai Revolution that took place in China when Taiwan was actually under Japanese rule. Zooming in on Tsai Ing-wen's presidency, specifically, she was very different from the very first democratically elected DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, in her approach to the legacy of Jiang Jingguo. She was much more moderate in her approach to commemorating his legacy, and presided over the opening of his presidential library, which I think was also a very important gesture of respect towards the legacy of ROC. This is all to say that even though public opinion studies, for example, the seminal inquiry into the question of core political attitudes, including identity, carried out by the Election Studies Center at the National Jiangxi University, shows us very strong empirical longitudinal evidence that the majority of residents of Taiwan identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. The relationship of people who live on Taiwan with the concept of the Republic of China is more complicated. And there are also voices in public debate in Taiwan that say that getting rid of these formal symbols of the Republic of China, such as large-scale celebrations of Double Ten, which I just mentioned, or maintaining the diplomatic allies, which is the leitmotif of our conversation today, could even amount to casus belli for China. That could be seen as an attempt to formally declare Taiwanese independence. That would be a departure from the line that has been assumed by the most recent two DPP presidents, but there's no need to formally declare independence because Taiwan is already de facto sovereign. But in order to maintain this appearance of maintaining status quo externally, institutions of the ROC may matter.
I would agree with 99% of what Marcin has just said. And I think that's the crux of the problem is the legacy institutions of the ROC. And absolutely, leaders like Tsai Ing-wen did a great job threading that needle and ensuring the status quo is there and that, the ROC Taiwan state has evolved to deal with its new situation. Where I would disagree is this notion that ending the diplomatic relations would be casus belli, right? Because this is what the PRC is trying to do. They're actively working very hard to peel away the countries that recognize the ROC. So, they're moving towards that goal. And if they succeed in peeling away the remaining ones, which I don't think they will ever fully succeed because a couple of them are, quasi-US territories. So that's another question. But, even if they succeed, that's their own goal. So they're not going to do that and then use their own actions as casus belli. Whereas, if some big changes domestically happen, such as changing the name of the country, changing certain symbols and the constitution, that certainly would be viewed as a casus belli provocation to war. But the question of diplomatic allies, so-called allies, we can just look at the PRC's behavior. They're the ones trying to peel away those allies. And I do think this is actually a misjudgment from the PRC standpoint because, they haven't really fully grappled with what's going to happen when that number gets to zero, when the ROC no longer exists. Well, then you've resolved the one China question, and you have one remaining China, and you have one Taiwan that is, carrying out foreign relations not through ROC embassies, but through these Taipei economic and cultural offices and similar named institutions run by the foreign ministry overseas. And I think, that's also part of the problem here is that the MOFA, which carries out Taiwan's foreign policy, has been organized for half a century on this question of contesting the definition of this one China and defending these diplomatic allies. So naturally, that leads to a state where today it's heavily, heavily focused on that. And that leads to a very large disconnect between Taiwan's defense policy, its security policy, which goes through other institutions such as, the Defense Ministry, the National Security Council, the Presidential Office, all of these different areas that are much more focused on dealing with Taiwan's defense, its relations with the United States and Japan. And that's a strong disconnect that we are seeing playing out in this really discordant foreign policy that Taiwan has.
Thank you very much. And there is another point that I really want to discuss. When Lai Ching-te tried to reach Eswatini, he could not because there were problems with flying through the airspace of some African nations, and then later on we were told that some European nations as well refused to facilitate a transit, with Germany and the Czech Republic being named. So this raises the question, why did these European countries in particular refused to allow Lai Ching-te to transit? The reason why I want to ask this is because this has created quite angry reaction from Taiwanese people who took that as a sort of betrayal from European nations, and I would like to understand exactly what the reason is. Let's mention also that a lot of people say this is economic coercion from China, but this doesn't look very realistic, the idea that such advanced economies could be coerced economically for such a little act. So please tell me what you know about this.
I believe that the record on denials of transit is quite mixed. There were some articles in Czech media that also quoted Czech government sources refuting the accusations by the Taiwanese side that these transfers were rejected. But even if we assume full veracity of the reports of Bloomberg, which was the first outlet that broke the story of these denied transits, then I don't think that we should look at it as yet another manifestation of Chinese pressure vis-a-vis the European states. One of the concepts or one of the phrases that we can hear evoked quite frequently in European conversations about the way we should engage with Taiwan is this idea of megaphone diplomacy, where European countries assign a very different weight to symbolism and substance in their relations with Taiwan, prioritizing more low-key, quiet, often non-public, behind closed doors engagement with Taiwan over larger statements that are primarily a form of strategic communication. So to this end, some of our listeners might recall the controversies surrounding the former Lithuanian government's decision to change this equilibrium and assign more weight to symbolism over substance when it allowed the opening of the Taiwanese rather than Taipei representative office in its capital of Vilnius. This is all to say that there is no precedent for publicly acknowledged transits of a sitting president of Taiwan through the European territory. And some of the political elites in Taiwan have commented on this issue. For example, former President Chen Shui-bian, despite his contested legacy, has said quite explicitly that he has always ensured the secrecy of his own transits to avoid similar scandals. The European countries have previously been reluctant to allow transits even for government officials from Taiwan at lower levels. And indeed, this emphasis on more technical cooperation at the level of, for example, heads of departments within ministries rather than high-level politicians that have a representative role of ROC Taiwan is an established pattern. And Taiwan has been able to move the needle on the limits of engagements recently. Poland is one of the good examples here where we have seen a really spectacular change in approach to hosting high-level Taiwanese officials. Some of the first visits by Joseph Wu to Poland in his capacity as a foreign minister under previous administration were kept completely under wraps. One of the visits was only saw the light of day because he engaged with students from Warsaw School of Economics, and one of the student groups published an article about this engagement. And now, with Lin Jialong in the seat of foreign minister, there have been public engagements. He spoke on record in various cities across the country. That has really changed. However, European countries probably also don't really see any political benefit or any meaningful political significance or economic or social significance of Lai Ching-te's visit to eSwatini to celebrate Mswati III's birthday. They fail to see it as anything more than kowtowing to an authoritarian leader. And here I would like to remark that unlike Taiwan, the European Union is actually attempting to do at least some democracy promotion work within eSwatini. Therefore, the cost of allowing such a transit was seen as too high with very little benefit.
Yeah, I think Martin really hit on most of the key points there. I would add, I think just logistically, it's very clear that MOFA and the presidential office completely messed this up. We don't know exactly what happened with the engagements, the attempts to get transit through Europe. There have been conflicting reports in Czech media, but I do think the German reporting is pretty accurate, which suggests that the MOFA had asked for within 2 hours a response to let Lai land on a presidential aircraft and then transfer to a private jet. This was denied, A, because they've always denied this, and B, because the United States had itself denied a transit by President Lai last year. And there's some, differences there, but the differences don't really matter. It's pretty clear how that these situations are analogous. And asking for an answer within a few hours for a trip that's been planned for months is it's not going to work. And it had kind of taken the worst of both worlds there. Of it was announced so far in advance that China had very, very ample time to, work to make sure that these three Indian Ocean states would block the transit and to be ready. But also when this last minute reach out attempt happened in Europe, immediately Chinese diplomats were working in Europe to counteract this. So it suggests that, as we know, is borne out in public cases, the presidential office, the MOFA, Taiwanese government institutions are quite leaky and have deep, deep problems when it comes to intelligence and safeguarding that. And it's quite different from the days of Chen Shui-bian, who was much, much more secretive about this. And of course, it was a different time. China was less powerful. There was presumably less intelligence infiltration at the time. But while he never transited Europe, to my knowledge, he did transit the Middle East and North Africa, even meeting with Muammar Gaddafi's son on a very surprise trip. And this is something that, again, it's kind of shocking that MOFA and the presidential office were unprepared to deal with this and then responded in a way where we know the Europeans would respond in the way they did. So it suggests that a real careful rethink is needed in that approach. And if they just done this the way from the start, the way it happened now, where the king of Eswatini sent his private jet, formerly Taiwanese jet, and then Lai secretly got on the plane and then flew back around. This all would have been avoided to begin with. But of course, that's not what happened, and it's all quite embarrassing for everyone involved. And I think at the end of the day, it's something that's accomplished nothing for Taiwan. There's no eSwatini expeditionary force coming to save Taiwan in the event of a Taiwan contingency.
And if I am correct, the United States also not always allowed Taiwanese presidents to transit in American territory. Am I right?
Of course. And in fact, this is an important thing for MOFA and Taiwanese government to understand. There is a law, there's a US law stating that the Taiwanese president and no other high-level official can be denied entry to the United States, right? That's been a law since the 1990s. In practice, does it have effect? No, because there's a very imbalanced security relationship between Taiwan and the United States. So when the US says no, don't visit or reschedule or stop in, Hawaii as opposed to mainland US, the Taiwanese follow that. And I think it reflects that for all the effort Taiwan has put in lobbying Congress, it's ultimately the executive where these decisions are made, regardless of what the US statutes say. And that's very important to think about in the coming years.
Sasha and Marcin, thank you so much. This was full of informations and indeed a very complex situation to understand. So thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks for having us on.
Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi visited Australia earlier this month. She was down under from the 3rd to the 5th of May. The visit generated few reactions and divided ones. In contrast with her bombastic media presence just a couple of months earlier, Sanae Takaichi was almost low-key during this trip. In Australia itself, it was generally seen as a good move, but one with limited impact. To comment on what happened, let's hear from two people with contrasting views. The first is Australian columnist Grant Wyeth, and in general, Grant sees the relationship between Canberra and Tokyo as solid.
Over the last maybe decade or so, the Australia-Japan relationship has become what now the Japanese Prime Minister called the other day a quasi-alliance. So previously, Australia has not had an alliance with anyone other than the United States and the United Kingdom. Japan, its alliances with the United States, and the relationship is starting to build an incredibly intimate series of cooperations, both in defense and the economic sphere as well. And so I would argue now that the Japan-Australia relationship is the closest relationship the two countries have outside their relationships with the United States. I think they both have a clear understanding of what is going on in the Indo-Pacific now. So from Australia's perspective, 3 of its 4 largest trading partners are in the Northeast Pacific Ocean. So China, South Korea, and Japan. Taiwan is also the 6th largest trading partner of Australia. So the sea lines of communication between Australia and Japan, or Australia and Northeast Asia, are absolutely essential to Australia's livelihood. So the recent national security strategy released by the Australian government has made, not only the defence of Australia's physical landmass a priority, but the sea lines of communication between Australia and its markets is also considered essential to our defence and essential to what we call what the defence strategy says the way of life as well. So making sure that there's no conflict in the Indo-Pacific and making sure those sea lines of communication remain open is absolutely essential. And the same for Japan. So Japan thinks, absolutely in the same way, in that it's a trading nation. It's a huge energy importer, I should say, an energy importer. It's an agricultural importer as well. It needs the sea lines of communication in the Indo-Pacific open as well. And any potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific, especially any potential conflict over Taiwan, would be disastrous for both countries. So I think there's a clear set of mutual interests that Australia and Japan have now, and they're both decided that they need to work incredibly closely in order to defend those interests.
Then let's give the floor to Professor Ingyu of Kansai Gaidai University in Japan. He sees more challenges in the relationship between the two countries.
Obviously, yes, it is true that it has strengthened verbally security ties with Japan and the United States. But it is still economically intertwined with China, and Australia obviously prefers risk management over confrontation. So here, look, China remains Australia's largest trading partner by a large margin. So the same thing for the UK. All the Commonwealth countries at the moment, including Canada, are fearing a possible, retaliation, economic retaliation from China if they go for, all-out war with China in tandem with, Takaichi's, pro-Taiwan policy. Canberra, for example, supports deterrence and rules-based order, but avoids formal anti-China military commitments over Taiwan. That's not possible at all. It has never been possible in all post-war history after 1949 for Australia. Australia's strategic culture traditionally balances alliance obligations with economic pragmatism. So pragmatism is similar here.
The visit itself is also viewed differently by the two witnesses.
It was a very warm and friendly visit. She was treated in a way that was reflective of how intimate the relationship has become. I think she understands these issues that I've just outlined very clearly as well. Her and Prime Minister Albanese had a good rapport between themselves as well, and so there was a clear there's a clear intimate relationship there, and there was a whole new range of areas of cooperation which were announced during the visit, including Australia purchasing a new fleet of Mogami class frigates from Japan, which is going to be Japan's largest arms export since it started removing its own controls on who it exports arms to. So this is that was a huge symbolic event as well. And I think, it was reflective, the visit was reflective of just how close the two countries have become.
I want to put it this way bluntly, that we need first to distinguish between strategic rhetoric and strategic commitment. What Takaichi's visit to Australia revealing to us is that she's generating headlines about democratic solidarity, Taiwan security, and so forth, but nothing concrete has come out from the meeting, like Australian commitment to Japanese bid for Indo-Pacific, strategic military alliance against China. So we don't have that kind of stuff coming out from her meeting. So I can say that there are 5 problems right now regarding Takaichi's solo diplomatic missions around Asia, I think. And point number 1, Australia is not going to help out so much as she wanted, because Australia is not going to choose Japan against China. The second problem is Southeast Asia. I think she has spent time talking a lot with South Asian allies like Thailand, Vietnam, and so forth. But Southeast Asia, India, and Korea are not going to help her out because they are also hedging. And point number 3 is that she's doing all this in bad timing because Donald Trump is going to meet Xi Jinping. That's a bad timing for her. And the number 4 problem is that she's facing enormous domestic political pressure to help out Taiwan, while curtailing Chinese military advance in the region. Although she can play rhetorics again for that purpose, but I don't think she can do much to please the domestic political incentives, or political constraints that she's facing. And finally, it's Taiwan. Taiwan can be happy for a while because they can gain symbolic benefits from Takaichi's open, allegiance to Taiwanese independence, Taiwanese security, and so forth. But in the end, Taiwan gets nothing really concrete again, other than, kind words, kind gestures from Takaichi. So structural constraints, especially during the meeting with Trump and Xi Jinping, will be a double blow after the first meeting between, KMT leader Cheng and Xi Jinping. So these are the five problems I see from this new political maneuver that Takaichi is playing in front of everybody.
Grant Wyeth and Ingyu both agree that the specter of China looms over the relationship between Japan and Australia, although they have contrasting views on what Japan should do.
There still is a certain concern that cooperation with Australia and Japan is very focused on China, and China is still our largest trading partner, and so a lot of people are worried that there's that might upset the Australia-China relationship as well if we're getting too close to Japan. So I think there is a bit of sentiment like that in Australia, but the relationship with Japan can exist outside of both countries' concerns about China.
The best posture is actually not doing anything at the moment because by not doing, meaning she can still have enough time to observe what Trump is going to do. She's going to have enough time. What's going to happen with the war in Iran will fall down. So this is a great moment for her to just wait and see instead of be actively involved in diplomatic postures, which will bring in nothing really tangible for her. Right now, the mass media, global media is paying more attention to Trump and Iran, not on Takaichi. So she made a bad movement right now. I would suggest she should, hold on to the domestic politics, a little bit more focused approach in the domestic political area rather than in the international area.
We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.